Hello, thank you everybody for joining us today. This is a part of the series on housing and research, joined by my esteemed colleagues from across the housing sector. So I am joined by Steve Mosely, who's the Executive Director of Governance and Transformation at L&Q, and Martin Hilditch, who's the editor of Inside Housing. Richard Hyde, who is the chair of the editorial panel for Thinkhouse, and Anne-Marie Bancroft, who is principal consultant at Altair. So this is a discussion today on the topic of how we can utilise customer voice to inform and shape service transformation and service delivery. So I'm going to start with a question to you, Anne-Marie, on what is customer voice?
Thanks, Kirsty. A very simple question, but then in the sector we probably don't ask it enough, in all honesty. My view on what customer voice is, and I'm always willing to accept challenge, is that customer voice is the way that your customers or customers of the social housing sector express their concerns or joy with the homes and communities that they live in and the services that they access. So that's my view of what customer voice is as an all-encompassing term. It's very tempting as a sector to suddenly just go straight to thoughts of scrutiny panels and customer voice mechanisms, not customer voice as a wider piece itself. So yes, that's my view. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add.
I think in the housing sector, we're quite used to gathering complaints and compliments. So what makes customer voice different just from that?
One of the things that there's a few things I try to put customer voice always into the context of, like, the ladder of participation. I think that's probably one of the best ways of trying to understand, because there's a lot of different mechanisms, different ways customers can influence, shape, design services, organisations, be part of organisational governance at the higher end of the ladder of participation, to just vocalising their concerns through a complaints process at one of the lower ends of the ladder of participation. And it's really important that as a sector we consider whereabouts different parts of our organisation, be that the governance parts of our governance services and how our organisations are run, to other different parts of our organisation, such as an ASB service, repair service, asset management. And that ladder of participation, in my experience, differs from organisation to organisation, but also differs from service to service. So you might find some customers really at the highest parts of that ladder, usually through customer engagement functions. They tend to have oversight of all customer engagement strategies, all customer engagement mechanisms, but at a lower level in other parts of the organisations, and commonly, and I'm not saying this is for all of the sector, commonly you tend to see a lower level in procurement and asset management, where residents aren't necessarily bringing climbing up that ladder, so to speak. And then as organisations are continually revisiting how they listen to and act on customer voice at a strategic level, a lot of boards and governance structures are starting to consider, what does that look like within a boardroom? What does that look like as in how our organisation is designed and shaped? What type of organisation and business are we? And what other mechanisms are there? So it's quite an interesting thing, customer voice within the sector, because usually we have, although not always, but we have quite a lot of separate types of businesses, and different businesses can allow that ladder to work and not in other places. So yes, it's something to really think about, in all honesty.
It sounds like it's more than just lip service of collecting some feedback. It's much more about embedding and making that feedback part of how the organisation works and delivers its services. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that customer voice is so important?
It's a good question. And what it is vital. Ultimately, customers live in the homes that providers provide, and they access the services that organisations design, and they are the people who ultimately receive the service. Quite often, if you have from a governance perspective, if you have a board that don't experience living within and living within the communities and homes that you provide, then there is an ultimate disjoint and a difficulty for boards to understand their own strategic decision making if they don't have a way of either experiencing that through lived experience and making and inviting residents and tenants to be part of the board themselves, or through various subcommittees that exist. We've seen a number of them crop up in the sector recently, or via understanding what that experience is through data, feedback, and really get into the detail of things, of really understanding what does a decent home look like for us. So for example, if we've got 100% decent home compliance, from a board perspective, if they've not got experience of what a decent home would look like in practical terms to a tenant walking into it at point of let, then how are they really going to understand what sort of services they actually provide? And I'm going to steal this from a colleague at Altair, but their theory always is that if you're on the board of Marks and Spencer's, you can go into Marks and Spencer's and actually experience that service. But if you're on the board of a housing provider, you can't quite go into and experience services in the same way that your residents do. So being conscious of that as an organisation is absolutely vital. Embedding voice through all different mechanisms is the best way of making things actually work, and it is the best way of providing the best services. Quite often, and I will wrap up in a minute, but quite often when you get residents around the table and ask them questions and tell them about the barriers you have and the difficulties that you have with particular services, they don't give you the answers that you would expect if you were sat at your desk. And that's really important, because quite often residents have the solutions that sometimes housing providers are either too cautious or concerned about visiting, and they usually have the solutions about how do we better manage our estates, how do we better deal with the communal cleaning. Residents have the more creative solutions because they're closer to the actual problem. And so that's my argument for customer voice. It is ultimately the right thing to do. We've always known that. It's just that the regulatory environment hasn't necessarily encouraged that as of late, but it always has been the right thing to do. And it works in the private sector. One of the organisations I really like for customer voice is Lego. They quite often they have lots of sessions with their customers, and they're able to shape and design products in a great way, and it's all really creative, and their involvement with their customers is absolutely fantastic. It's obviously turned to fruition and profit for organisations such as Lego, but in the social housing sector, because we're not profit driven, we don't see that benefit as much. So I think it's great that the sector's starting to revisit its approach, that people like me are sat on panels like this, which is really helpful. So yes, back to you, Kirsty.
Thank you. Steve, I can see you nodding in agreement. Is there something you'd like to say as well?
Yeah, there's loads that resonates with what Anne-Marie has said, and particularly that sort of traditional stratified way that we tend to sort of separate different forms of engagement. So resident governance and sort of resident customer voice at the other end. The last thing that sort of really resonated with that was that point about lived experience. And I think that's something that we're very conscious of. The resident chair of our resident board said, actually, from their perspective, they can never speak for residents. It's impossible for one person to speak for 100,000 residents, but they're bringing something in the room of that lived experience, which shapes the way that we deliver services. And if we don't listen to that properly, we can't deliver the right sort of services. So I think something that we've focused on a lot recently, two things. One is about, I would sort of talk about power, and there is a power imbalance from organisations that sort of run the sector, and how that parent-child relationship happens with the residents. And so the real focus that we're doing at the moment is how do you transfer some of that power to the residents so they are holding us to account in a different way, driving it in a different way. And it can be quite scary, quite challenging to actually get right, but it's absolutely sort of, you know, the place that we need to be. The other one is just about making it easy and having a menu of options. And again, it was really interesting that Anne-Marie mentioned procurement. You know, there's a lot of internal cultural work looking at teams and who've never thought of it perhaps as their job to deal with customer voice and think about how they then introduce that into their process. And there's one practical example that I can give that we've undertaken sort of major works program. So this is a £1 billion program. It's a really big program. The way that we would have probably traditionally approached it before is we would have set the framework, procured it, engaged, consulted with our residents, but it would be, you know, what do you think about this, and got them to kind of rate the people that are providing it. This time we started the other way around, and we went to our residents first before we'd engaged anybody and say, what does this mean to you? What outcomes are good? What would it look like if we did this really well? And so that was the basis on what we sort of set the procurement up. Again, for a sort of multi-billion-pound program of investment in our homes, investment in their homes going forward. It was really uncomfortable for some of our contractors. They weren't kind of used to that approach, and we've continued it after letting the contract. So rather than us, I suppose, as a board and executive team, looking at our performance and saying to residents, what do you think? Hold us to account on that. It's trying to turn that power dynamic the other way around and saying for residents, we're going to tell you, executive and board, whether we think you're doing a good job based on the outcomes that we want to see. So it's a nuance around it, but I think it's something that has kind of really helped us to sort of, you know, link that together. And the other point about making it easy, perhaps sometimes get that voice, and particularly around engagement. Residents might be thinking about, well, maybe I can't get involved in this. So there's some sort of impediments to me getting involved. What we're asking for people is to come to us, and we will work with them through a sort of volunteering approach to say, well, how about this? How we could match you to this. And there's some, you know, really great examples that we've had around residents with sort of learning disabilities that we've engaged by tailoring a way that they can work with us to give their voice and feedback, again, that we haven't done before. We have a partially sighted resident as an estate champion. Again, they were kind of, well, I don't think we can do that. And we were, how can we make it work in a way that it works for you and you can input into that? So there's some really good examples around that, but it does, and, you know, we are definitely not there, but we're trying to challenge ourselves in terms of the thinking and make sure that we look at those examples that we can do.
Sounds like a very exciting journey, Steve. And has the feedback so far been positive from customers that have been involved?
Yeah, it's been really good. Like I say, we're trying to adapt it as we go through. So we have approached this looking at, again, inspiration outside our sector. We do tend to be sort of inwardly focused sometimes, and we ask residents how they felt their experience of, you know, engaging with us, customer voice was like. And the phrase that came out more than anything was around volunteering. They were voluntarily giving up their time and input to get involved with us. And so we looked at other sectors. We've got a framework. So we treat it as that. You know, it's the onboarding process, if you like, is about to support and equip residents to do the thing that they want to do. We have an agreement where we sign up to deliver things to kind of support them in that process, which could be you know, various forms of training or other support that they want. And we're really clear what we're putting into it. And it's just that range for somebody with a busy life, with children, and working life, might be on being part of our e-panel. And that might be the only level at which they want to get that voice into the organisation. For us, that's really valuable because that's 4,000 L&Q residents who are on that panel who are providing us with feedback. For others, it might be estate estate champions. Some it might be those formal governance structures, but again, we look at, can we make those governance structures less formal? Is there an opportunity to have more of it online? When are we scheduling them? Are we getting as wide a demographic as we can by making sure that we're scheduling at times that people with, caring responsibilities, full-time jobs are able to contribute in the way that they are? So, it's very much a sort of learning process and going through. And I think we're going to do some things broadly which won't work, and we'll do some things that will, really will work. And it's kind of as we go through, well, that was good. Why was it good? Let's evaluate. Let's do a bit more of that. But I would say the main thing is we've got to be a bit brave and open ourselves up to it, and be prepared to sort of be a bit uncomfortable and fail in some of those areas. And if we don't do that, we'll kind of carry on doing the same thing all the time. So it does require a bit of bravery. Open yourself up, and really listen to people, what people are saying to you, and show them that link into the input. You said this, and the output was this. I think if people can feel engaged in it in that way, they're much happier to volunteer, to give up their time.
It sounds very much like you're using that sort of mechanism of listening to customers and informing your practice in developing your approach to using customer voice. So you're already embedding that within how you work. It sounds really like an exciting journey, and great to hear about so many people having the opportunities to be involved and utilise their many strengths. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, it can flow through to other areas. Again, Anne-Marie mentioned about procurement. One of them was recruitment. So, we went through a major restructure, change to smaller housing patches. Again, a traditional approach might be we're doing this, and we will get feedback from residents afterwards about how that's landing. We had 100 residents that volunteered to recruit our neighbourhood leads, our new housing structure. So they were shaping what they would expect that relationship to be like, rather than me as a non-resident trying to think about it. So they're involved in the recruitment, and they were involved in the recruitment in terms of shaping the exercises. So one of those was shaping a case and understanding like the empathy that somebody showed in dealing with it, not necessarily the formal qualifications bit. How is the empathy, and how do they deal with that? And then we've used the sort of the segments from that, Vox Pops, to use that on an ongoing training program for the rest of our colleagues. So, culture, empathy is really important. I think there's some, base level standards, and there is a big debate in the sector about qualifications, and fully support that, understand the reasons behind it. But qualifications on their own will not deliver the outcomes we need. There's got to be that point about, do you care about the outcome at the end of it? Are you going to have empathy with residents and understand, put yourself in their shoes and do the right thing for them? And that really, going back to the first point, can only come from somebody who has lived experience and saying, this is how I received that service, this is what it feels like.
Thank you. Martin, you may well have examples of where organisations have really sort of transformed as a result of using a customer-centric approach.
Yeah, I think it's there's a range of models kind of emerging. I mean, I think it's interesting to hear Steve talk about what they're doing at the moment. Lots and lots of different kind of models starting to emerge. Lots of people kind of wrestling with this as an issue in a way that perhaps they haven't done for quite some time. I mean, there's obviously a number of drivers behind that, including the increased regulatory scrutiny in this area. And I think what I would say that kind of addressing that power, probably up front, just to say that the model itself, I think we've seen things gone wrong in a number of organisations with different levels of tenant involvement at kind of board and senior level. So I think the model itself doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get everything right. So just to kind of get that out there up front, it is about addressing that kind of power imbalance and actually a voice with influence. So a voice that is going to influence change and not be lost in this in the system. So just to put that up front, but I think there are a few organisations which I think are doing some quite interesting things. I mean, one of the ones I was reflecting on recently, I think, is SOHA, because they spoke at our recent tenant and resident engagement conference, and one of the things that struck me about SOHA is they've got residents on their central board, and I think just one of my takeaways from that was when it came to rent setting this year, I think broadly speaking in England, most organisations took exactly the same approach to rent setting for understandable reasons. But SOHA, I think, had that resident involvement right at board level and took a slightly different approach. So set slightly lower rents or rent increases than others in the sector. So actually it appeared from speaking to the residents there that voice had influenced that decision making, and you can obviously debate the rights and wrongs of that decision, but nonetheless it appears that had a direct influence in terms of policy, and it was slightly different to many other organisations with perhaps less central involvement of tenants and residents. So I thought that was an interesting model to look at. There are others emerging. Again, you can look at I mean, relatively well established ones like Phoenix Community Housing. I think they've been doing some really interesting stuff. They are often in and among the prize winning entrants at various award ceremonies because they can back up the involvement of tenants and residents with delivery, and then other models that I think are perhaps less well established, but nonetheless kind of interesting to look at. Southern Housing, I think, I think they've got more tenants residents on their board than a central board than many other organisations of similar sizes and scales. I think it's early days there, but a model worth looking as it develops. So there's different people trying different things, and I think one of the interesting things is going to be absolutely fascinating to watch in terms of evidence, in terms of the tenant satisfaction measures. Again, plenty of debate about whether they're a good way of capturing meaningful information about organisations, but I think it will start a conversation about how that data is captured, how meaningful it is, so it will actually start a conversation about where that voice is influencing, and how you look to measure that and understand the influence of tenants within organisations. So I think that will take things on a bit as well. And I'll just round off with one thing, because it's one of my obsessions, I think, in terms of the central system, is the missing voices, and I think that would be, for me, and this fits in with campaigning work that Inside Housing is going to be doing later in the year, so it's why I'm kind of wrestling with it particularly. People who want to access, so want to be involved in the sector purely on the basis of living in the homes, so who don't have the stable housing, and queuing up, frankly, to get into the homes that housing associations and councils own and manage. So I think those voices are missing in the system, and in terms of the delivery of new housing, which I think is one of the central aims of Thinkhouse. I think a conversation about how they have involvement in the system and decisions are made is really important as well. So not just tenants and residents who are already in the sector, living in the homes, but the people who aren't, who want to be, who don't have stable housing solutions. So I think their voice is one that I'm really interested in terms of thinking about how we get that in the system.
Thank you very much, Martin. And it just prompts me to think about something, Anne-Marie, I think you've been working on a project recently, which is a research piece, which is particularly around floor coverings. I don't know if there's something that you might be able to share a little bit about that.
So Altair has been commissioned by Longley Foundation, who's a grant-making partner in the social housing sector. They issue grant on behalf of housing providers across the sector to residents that need it, and a lot of their grant is issued to residents who are let homes without floor coverings at point of let. So that identifying that gap in provision resulted in them seeking a research partner to be able to identify a bit of an understanding around the provision of floor coverings in the sector. Now, a similar piece of work was conducted by TAIPARB and TPAS in Wales, and it's affected regulatory change, or nearly affected regulatory change in Wales, with the Welsh Housing Quality Standard. So the research is over 5 phases. We've already released our first report, which is the scene setting, which established 80% of landlords 80% of homes are provided at point of let without floor coverings. And when floor coverings are provided, it's at the landlord's driver, not for tenants, not driven by tenant need. The next phase of research is ultimately about tenant experience in relation to what it's like to experience lack of and provision of floor covering, and the impact that has both financially, on a personal level, on a community basis. And that next phase will be a group or a series of qualitative conversations with residents across the mainland UK, and then also some quantitative data to really give us a robust picture of what that experience might look like for residents. We all sort of know there's a big moral case there, let's be honest, and the research is very much focused on trying to build a business case as well for the sector to try and really understand what does it actually mean. We always hear little bits of information that'll probably reduce your void turnaround, it probably increase tenant satisfaction. This research seeks to put some definites behind those things. So that whole phase of research is going to be purely focused on what that experience is for residents. And it's ultimately really important to really establish what that may look like for the sector, and hopefully convince providers and potentially the regulator to change decent homes standards, and retrospective ones in England, Scotland and Wales, but also to really put forward that case to residents, to landlords. So you're more than welcome to. Obviously the research is highly publicised by its nature. There was a comment piece in Inside Housing to try and continue its publication, and you'll be hearing a lot about it, but it's absolutely vital that you pick it up and have a read. So yeah,
it's fantastic to hear that gathering the views of people who live in housing association homes is being used as an integral part of informing sort of, I guess, the conclusions and the findings and any recommendations of that piece of research. Well, I'm going to wrap up now at this point. It's been really great to speak to you all. Thank you all very much for joining me, and to everybody that has taken the time to watch our video. Please stay tuned for further short videos from this series, and if you'd like to find out more about any of the topics that we've talked about today, you can get in contact with me via email at kirsty.hickson@altairltd.co.uk. Thank you.